extend funding probably through December, maybe into December. At that point, hopefully both chambers will have had a chance to meet, sit down, work out their differences, and pass some spending bills. Also on the federal to-do list is the USMCA, the new NAFTA, the trade agreement between the three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico. The Democrats in the House right now have working groups set up. They are trying to decide what it is they want to see in a trade deal. And hopefully those groups will be reporting back to the administration shortly. And depending on what the speaker wants to do, it's probably likely that something will come to the floor of both the House and Senate by the end of the year on trade. A couple other issues that will take up a lot of time in the Congress are tax extenders, both with technical corrections and with health extenders. These can be small deals, these can be big deals, but they will end up taking up and eating a lot of time that the Congress has to deal with on legislation between now and the end of the year. The temporary assistance for needy families reauthorization expires on September 30th, so there will be a great deal of focus on that when the Congress returns after Labor Day. The flood insurance reauthorization needs to happen, which of course is a big issue with Florida. The Export-Import Bank also expires at the end of September, so once the Congress gets back, you can kind of see they have a lot of issues pending that have to be dealt with immediately that expire at the end of September. We put the FAST Act up there. FAST Act is the Surface Transportation Act, as you all probably know. That's not expiring until a year from September, but those conversations, those negotiations are actually taking place now. That will be a big issue, obviously, for us, and we will obviously all be monitoring that for you on your behalf. The Bipartisan Budget Act, I'm sure everybody read about this in the newspaper. This was the agreement that was reached between Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Not only did the agreement on a bipartisan basis agree to extend the debt limit for 2 years, which means that the federal government will be able to satisfy its debts for the next 2 years, which is actually, for a 2-year extension, is a relatively long extension in terms of debt limits. But it also raised the spending caps for how the federal government can spend their money. The bipartisan compromise was that not only did we raise spending on defense issues, but we also raised spending on domestic issues. So it was kind of a win-win for both parties negotiating at the table, in addition to the fact that the debt limit also got raised. This will also all affect how the appropriations bills start to come together in late September, October, and November. As of now, the Democratic House spending bills are about $10 billion over what the agreed upon terms were. That'll all get worked out in conference. Those numbers will come down $10 billion, they'll have to. But those will all get worked out and hopefully passed in December. This is kind of what I just talked about in terms of the appropriations bills. The Senate is working on them now. Senator Shelby from Alabama, who chairs the Senate Appropriations Committee, has his staff in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate working on this all through the month. We expect to see some bills once they return right after Labor Day in terms of Senate committees dealing with their appropriations bills. As I mentioned, the House has dealt with 10 of the 12 appropriations bills, has passed on the floor 10 of 12 appropriation bills. The only two that haven't passed in the House are the Homeland Security bill and the Legislative Affairs bill. Homeland Security bill is obviously the big contention among the House and Senate right now because Homeland Security is where a wall along Mexico is funded. Transportation appropriations.
So, in terms of what the House did, the House on the transportation appropriations on the transit side is they funded the programs, all the formula programs at the authorized level. And then on the capital investment grants, they also funded it at the authorized level and broke it out the different categories of projects, identifying specific projects for each category. Although for the small starts, we don't know what those projects are yet, but they just create a pot of money for folks to chase and for FT to allocate once they've identified the projects that are ready to go forward. They funded the expedited delivery project program, which is right now pretty much earmarked for a project from BART to San Jose, Berry Rapid Transit to San Jose. They're the only project that's opted to go through that program, so they're going to be the ones to get the money. They've funded the highway program at the authorized level with the bump up from general fund monies, and they also funded the build program at $1 billion, which is a little bit over last year's funding level, and I suspect that that will stick since the Senate likes this program a whole lot. As we go into authorization, as Carl mentioned, the current authorization bill expires September 30th of next year. So we're on a pace to try to get that done. And the committees have all held hearings. They've begun to put together proposals. So they're beginning to try to move them forward. The first out of the box was the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And just to understand, in the House, jurisdiction over transportation is under a single committee. It's under the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. So they handle everything from highways to safety to transit to freight railroads. They handle it all. In the Senate, that jurisdiction is divided among several committees. And so Environment and Public Works is responsible for highways. Commerce is responsible for freight railroads and safety. And banking is responsible for transit. So you'll see this bifurcated jurisdiction in the Senate. So you'll begin to see bills roll out in the Senate as we move forward. And so the Senate bill came out with a bill that provided a 28% increase, with the bulk of that increase in the first year of the bill, and then 2 to 3% thereafter, after the first year. They also included some new provisions in there. It was very important to the Democrats as part of this bipartisan bill that there be climate change or resiliency built into all the highway programs, to really begin to look at the impact of changing climate and building that into all highway investments, to look at the impact and make them resilient. In addition, there was an electric vehicle charging program that would basically begin to put money towards charging stations along major interstates to sort of enhance the growth of electric vehicles. And so that's also part of the bill, so there'll be funding for that. Now, like all things, that provision's already begun to engender some opposition from the current gasoline suppliers and alcohol fuels folks who feel like that gives them a competitive advantage to electric vehicles by having the federal government stepping in and creating charging stations. But it is an indication of where the committee wants to go and where Congress wants to go and begin to recognize the future in terms of the change in the type of fuels that will power vehicles. So, in addition, I know this is an issue that's quite very important to HART, given the incident happened this spring. And this is a bill that would basically create some funding to provide protection to drivers of vehicles and to create actual infrastructure investment to help protect the drivers of buses and mostly bus drivers, give them some protection. And it's a program to help fund and ensure their safety, try to provide de-escalation training and other tools to try to address sort of violence against bus drivers. And so this bill was introduced, and it's gotten pretty broad support in the House, not as much support in the Senate, but the goal is to try to attach that to the authorization bill when it actually begins to move forward. And so we wanted to bring it to your attention, knowing how important this is to HART in terms of the incident you had this spring. Carl, talk about pending applications.
So as of right now, HART has 3 grant applications pending before the federal agencies, 2 at the FTA, one dealing with low or no emissions grants, and then one dealing with bus and bus facility grants. The third one is a program designed by HART around the upcoming Super Bowl that Tampa will host, and it deals with a public education campaign on human trafficking. So those are the 3 we have pending. We've always enjoyed a great deal of support among our congressional delegation in support for these projects. Mr. Lemmer came up in May and met with not only the entire Tampa Bay delegation, both United States Senator offices, but the committees of jurisdiction too, banking and transportation infrastructure, and then also had meetings at Department of Transportation and the FTA as well. We look forward to having you all back to continue those conversations. It's always helpful for members to hear directly from you all, not only here when they're at home in the district, but when they're also up in DC, working up in DC. So, back to you.
So I'm going to do a second presentation of the Lean Powers Up. I was asked to put this together in largely because as we presuming a favorable court decision by the Supreme Court on the sales tax, the region will begin to look at potential funding for future fixed guideway investments or capital investments in the region. And so I was asked to sort of give you an overview of the Capital Investment Grants Program, which is the principal funding source that will fund projects. Bus rapid transit, light rail, streetcar projects are funded out of that program. Now I can go in, as Ben knows because you know me a long time, I can go as deep a dive as you want to go in this program because I've been working on this program since 1982, but I will spare you that and give you a broad overview of the program and then can get into any detail you want to get into. But this is just an overview of the process of how it works for small starts, new starts, and the most important thing you'll see in sort of how it breaks out is that new start projects are core capacity, those projects that are above $300 million in total cost. And so your match ratio is based on the project cost, but federal share is at least, total project cost is at least $300 million. And you'll notice in the new starts versus small starts, there's an additional step for new starts core capacity that doesn't exist for small starts. And that's the step for engineering. And so there are different processes. So as we understand those two different processes, how you manage project going through one program versus the other is very important in terms of the timing of when you initiate work. And how, because under the current administration, the big pressure on new starts is to do as much work prior to project development, because you only have 2 years to complete project development, and right now you lock in your federal share and your capital cost during project development and not engineering. So you better have a very high level of confidence in your schedule and your cost before you move your project into project development, because you've only got 2 years to finish it, and then they'll do the risk assessment during project development. So that, as a current structure of the program, that becomes important. Now the House does have a provision that would change that policy and basically not have you lock in your money until 180 days after completion of project development and give you time to request entry into engineering. So you have time in that space between project development engineering or during engineering to refine your project cost estimates. If that goes forward, that will change how you deliver projects to the program. So it's important to keep in mind of that as we go forward, because structuring the process will become very different if we go to that approach, if it prevails in conference. So that's, as I said, I can go in deep dive as you want to, but it's important as we begin to look at that, as you begin to look and making decisions about projects that would be pursuing federal dollars, that becomes a very important decision to be made in terms of the process. Small starts are projects that are under $300 million. What also makes them distinctive, besides not having the engineering step, is the cap on federal monies is $100 million. So the moment you go above $200 million project cost, you're immediately above 50-50 split. Now most projects that are in the Small Starts program are bus rapid transit projects. You'll see at least 90-95% of the projects are BRT projects around the United States. There's very few rail projects that have been funded from Small Starts. There have been a few, but not many. So this is just an overview of the review process, so we don't have to go into detail, but it does become important. Going forward, we'll need to have a discussion about what decisions you own and what decisions that the city and county own. And some of you who wear two hats, it's important to understand who owns what decision and who can influence what factors as you go forward, because the most important thing I would say about this is that FTA doesn't want promises, they want plans and policies. So they want adopted policies that address each of these areas. And so the jurisdiction that has responsibility for that policy has got to develop, they've got to adopt that and make a firm commitment to make those changes, whether it be in land use, whether it be in economic development. Those changes and those policies have to be adopted. They cannot be promises of adoption. And so we'll talk about that going forward in terms of who owns what decisions as a project progresses through the process. What did I just do? Did I hit a button? Oh, there we go. Okay, I apologize. This is just the timeline. I think the important thing in here, I'm looking at the timeline, and I'm going to give you my standard speech. There's no rewards for being optimistic. Okay? There's no rewards for being optimistic. It's better to be very honest about how long it's going to take a project to go forward. It's better to be very honest about what it's actually going to cost. Because the headlines that get written when you fall behind schedule and the headlines that get written when you have cost overruns are not good ones. So it's important to be very realistic as we're developing project schedules and project costs to avoid optimism bias. And it plagues the industry, and it gets us in a lot of trouble when we have optimism bias as we move projects through the process. So a little early warning as you begin to take projects through the process, it's important to be very realistic about what it takes to deliver those projects. This is a financial issue, and this is also very important because, once again, the FTA wants to advance your project. The good news for you with respect to the sales tax is you've already met one of the principal requirements, is you have the bulk of the money already committed by virtue of the sales tax. That's very important in terms of enhancing your project rating. The other way you can enhance your project rating is to increase the local share above 50%. The moment you go above 50%, you get a half-step improvement in your rating for your financial plan for your project by overmatching the project. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of a growing prevalence of overmatch given capital cost, but we'll talk about that in a second. So here's the share. What we've done is graphed every project that's gone forward over the last couple of years to look at what the match ratio is for those projects. And what you're going to see is a decided trend line. If I were to plot this over time, you would see that 10 years ago it was 50-50. began to trend about 5 years ago, about 60-40. We're now, when you look at project costs, we're below 40% in terms of federal contribution. Now, some of that is driven by, when we're looking at major capital projects around the United States in the New Starts program, there are no more projects below $2 billion. Almost every project's above $2 billion. So what happens then as a result of that is there's theoretically only about 125, 150 million you can get per year. So when you look at that over a 5 or 6 year period, you're immediately capped out in terms of how much capital investment grant money you can get for a project for those major light rail projects. So what that does then is it says, okay, you're going to have to get creative about your funding and financing. And so one of the discussions that we'll need to be having going forward is sort of leveraging those dollars through bonding or financing. And looking at the TIFIA program or other financing mechanisms to take advantage of a sales tax that's dedicated to you and how to leverage that sales tax best to advance projects. And so that'll be a conversation for the HART board going forward. How do we leverage the monies and how do we advance projects? How do we use financing to advance those projects? With the caveat being it's a 30-year revenue source. And so like how can we advance those projects over that 30-year period? And what realistically can't be done out of that revenue source is we begin to look at sort of funding it year by year or looking at financing against it. But those are all sort of future decisions, but it's important to be mindful of sort of this policy and begin to look at what FTA's expectations are around the share and about the financing plan. This is just an example of where the pipeline is in terms of the projects that are out there. These are selected currently FFG, full funding grant agreement projects that were recently executed. You're looking at what's in the pipeline to be executed. There's quite a few projects. And we look at sort of the pipeline in terms of look at small starts and other projects in the engineering phase. So we're seeing a queue of projects that work their way through the process. And I have a tables that I maintain, which this information is drawn out of, that tracks every single project in the queue. And I look at the schedules of every single project in the queue, and also do tables to break out those projects as to when they're expected to hit the program, to look at the out-year impacts of those projects in terms of the capacity of the capital investment grants program and how many projects that program funds. So I do a waterfall analysis to look at how projects, as they come to the program, what that impact is in the future so we can know exactly how much money might be available for a project going forward. So I do that right now to help members of the capital investment grants working group sort of plan and sort of look at the future, sort of how they might fit into the program. And then likewise the small starts. The difference with small starts versus new starts and capital and core capacity projects, small starts typically are funded in a single fiscal year because they're typically lower cost projects. The federal share is typically less than $100 million. And so FTA recently has tried to fund to get those projects in and out in a single year. So you'll see that if, to the extent that we have any BRT projects, most of them will be small start projects. Most of them will be funded in a single fiscal year. So the moment that we get them ready, we go in and make our request to FTA, and that project typically would be funded in a single fiscal year as opposed to a multi-year grant agreement. So that's also important as we begin to look at the future, what projects we want to advance as a region. And then this is all the projects right now that are in some phase of project development. So there's quite a few, and you'll see the vast majority of them are bus rapid transit projects, but and while that seems like a lot, most of those projects are asking somewhere between $30 to $50 million federal share. The program, the money's allocated for small starts was $535 million last year, a little over $400 million this year. So there's room for several projects to go through. So, I mean, as much as we get overwhelmed by the pipeline, as I like to say, it's Darwinism at its best. Good projects survive, and there's a way they find room for themselves in the program when you're ready to move forward. And the most important thing that affects these projects is funding. A lot of folks are trying to find funding, and having a dedicated funding source puts you in a very strong position relative to other jurisdictions that don't have a dedicated funding source, and particularly an uncommitted revenue source that you have presently for the sales tax, assuming once again a favorable court decision by the end of the year. With that, I'll be ready to answer any questions you might have.
Are there any questions? Director Shanahan?
Who's the Democratic sponsor of the safety bill on the Senate side? You said that there's no Republicans. I just was wondering.
In the House?
No, in the Senate.
I don't think so.
I'll count on the House.
I mean, the House from your report has mixed. Where I'm going is where is Marco and Rick Scott in terms of understanding this, I mean, that's an opportunity for us from a perspective of briefing them on behalf of the union advocating for this. And You know, I think there's been other incidences down south. We had Palm Beach here, that it might be an opportunity for us to make sure that they are somewhere, but I just didn't know who the sponsor was on the Senate side, because as you know, it's all about collegiality and what committee it comes out of and
Right.
blah, 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 so.
I do not know who the Senate sponsor was.
We-
It's Napolitano in the House,
Yeah.
but I'll send that to Ben.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I think that would be important for us to,
It was introduced in the House earlier than it was in the Senate. It's just
Right.
recently been introduced in the Senate, so I think it's still working its way through the Senate.
well, and it's always, you know, it's easier in the House because they have one committee.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. But I still think from a perspective of advocacy with the Palm Beach, I think potentially Miami and Hillsborough, both of those gentlemen that want to run statewide, this is a very important jurisdictional area. And we should make sure that they're briefed on that this is a priority for them to get behind the bill. But I'm sure there's politics, oh, sorry, I have a stiff neck, behind the, you know, why there's no Senate, why there's no Republicans in the Senate. And maybe it's timing, which would be helpful to know, but it could be something else. And I think we as a board should consider some sort of expression of their engagement, requesting their engagement.
Menendez from New Jersey.
so
Yeah,
I
that
did.
could explain a lot.
I did meet with, in partnership with the ATU, the in-district leadership of both senators,
Right.
with the understanding they were gonna follow up with the individual offices to see about an in-person meeting up in Washington. So just looking forward to hearing back from them. But we did brief the staff on the details. The ATU passed along hundreds and hundreds of letters of support to each of the offices as well, so stay tuned.
Well, we should definitely stay on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Good, that was an informative presentation, and we've already committed our money to the doors. I mean, speaks loudly of our board's commitment and this agency's commitment. So we'll go next to the 2019 state legislative session report.
Good morning. My name is Mark Delagal with Holland Knight also. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I wanted just to say that, just a little bit of background. We gave a end of session report in May. So this is kind of forward looking as we get ready for next session, just to orient you as we go. So let me make sure that I'm operating this thing correctly. Am I pushing the top button? Oh, the arrow, right? That makes sense. The other, it's been pushed so many times, it's not there. All right, so let me tell you how this is going to shape up from a broad perspective. The legislature will meet this year early, now constitutionally early. They will begin session, January 14th? I know it's early January. So everything's pushed earlier by 2 months. I think you got to keep in mind that even though that I say that to be true, December is a slow month because people are not necessarily wanting to be at it as much as they would in other months of the year. So we'll crank it up September, and what that means is there'll be a lot of presentations, people getting their sea legs. October, things will start getting more serious, and then November will be a lot of work. I think December will be a relatively low-key meeting cycle. But so November, look for November. Now November is important because there's starting to be deadlines in November. So for example, if we're looking for an appropriation, our appropriations materials, and I'll hit on that in a minute, are due in November 15th. To the budget process. The House of Representatives, the last 3 years, I believe it is, and now this will be the 4th year, requires a detailed process for requesting appropriations that materializes in an actual legislative bill. So we will gather our information, we will submit it into a form, and there will be a bill produced. The bill, in order to be considered, the issue to be considered as part of the budget in the Florida House has to be heard in at least one committee to be eligible for the budget. We were successful last year, just by way of reference, getting both of our initiatives heard, and they were therefore eligible. The Senate does not require first of all, it requires a form, so that is similar, but it does not produce a bill, like a numbered bill, and it does not require a presentation. But last year, the Senate has gone to what I call open mic night. And they encourage members of the Senate to come to the committee and present. Both of our projects were presented last year. I think that is best practice, and we did that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at from a landscape perspective with the budget. Any year you're getting ready to ask for money, you need to have a understanding of the playing field. Is there money or is there not? There have been times in the past when there was a deficit and lots of cutting was going to have to take place. It does not appear that that's what we're faced with. The group that's charged with estimating the revenues for the state of Florida has begun to release some reports, and they'll do that consistently as we lead up to session. But it appears to be somewhere in the $437 million of recurring revenue based on the last report, and over $742 million of non-recurring revenue. Now, there's all kinds of things I could get into about exactly what those numbers mean. I think those are pretty good estimates, though, at least to understand. There will be money for projects, I think, is the takeaway from that message. I just mentioned about non-recurring. There's a pot of money. All right, so what is it that HART will be looking at? One of the things that we are working with staff on is identifying some discrete needs that we need that we're not already receiving either state or federal dollars on. And we're working with both the legislative staff, which I've spoken to as recently as this morning, about how to craft our request so it doesn't run afoul with our grant request that we're requesting, and also working with the governor's office on that. A bit of bad news, I think you should probably have already heard this. When I stood here in May, we were optimistic that we had received $500,000 for our ITS improvements from the state, but Governor DeSantis vetoed that money. That was disappointing, and I can talk more about that if you want to. So let me mention from a standpoint of what we at least have targeted from possibly looking at is funding for a charging station. Now, that's not fully developed. It'll be up to the committee here and, of course, the full board to approve that which we seek. But right now, that's one idea. As far as planning for the session, I think one of the things that Ben has put a priority on is better relationships and improved relationships and continued development of relationships with our local delegation. So to that end, we have begun to meet with some of the key legislators. We're starting with those who have helped us last session. So Senator Roussan filed an initiative for us in the Senate last year, as did Representative Driscoll. Ben has a meeting with Senator Roussan coming up, I believe, next week, and he already met with Representative Driscoll. Another project we had Representative Toledo help us with, and Senator Cruz. There's a Senator Cruz meeting on the calendar, and the Toledo meeting in the works. We're also going to work through what I would say the rest of the delegation. And I'll kind of go through that in a minute. And then in Tallahassee, what we'll take over is meeting with those of you I think are all pros at this, but the appropriations process is largely controlled by a select subset of senators and members of the House. And that is your chairman, your sub-chairman of the appropriations committee. So depending on what silo we're looking for resources in, whether it be criminal justice or whether it be transportation, we'll work with the budget subcommittee chairs and the full appropriations chairs, of course, the leadership presiding officers. Part of that program, which Ben and your team did last year, was a great start, and we'll continue to do that, is Visits to Tallahassee, where we not only meet with the elected officials, but we'll also be meeting with the executive office staff, whether that's been the governor's office of policy and budget, but also with the legislative committee staff as well, which we made our rounds with last year as we went through. I think we've talked about this in the past. I think that my tactic or my way of approaching the legislature and seeking funding for policy is a drip, drip, drip approach, which is you're competing for their time and attention and their resources. So to the extent that there's a constant pass-through of visits, whether it be from you on the committee or the board, or whether it be from staff, I think that is the best approach. So last year, by way of example, we had a couple of visits from HART leaderships on the staff perspective, and we'll want to continue that. I know Ben, immediately upon being appointed, came to Tallahassee, as did the previous executive staff. Once we get our, this chart here is about policy development. I think Ben has mentioned to us about addressing some policy issues in addition to simply seeking money. One of the issues that's, of course, first at front of top of the list would be some safety initiatives. One idea we had, but we've done some research, so I think we may be okay. We may want to look at it again, but it's enhanced penalties for people who assault bus drivers. That's already the law in Florida, as we've researched it and found out. But we may want to take another stab at some safety measures that would be above and beyond that. The rest of this is just kind of what we do for you, which is to track and monitor legislation. We work with certainly the large associations of the cities and the counties, but also you're a member of the Florida Public Transit Association, which is led by Lisa McCoe, and Ben serves with that group, and we work with them as well. They try to coordinate all of the transit agencies in the state of Florida. They're primarily focused on policy, not on funding initiatives, and which tend to be particular to any jurisdiction. I'll just pass over the next slide. We read through that later. Political landscape. So let me talk a little bit about the politics of the session, because I think you know, for those of you in the world of politics, there's money and how the money exists, and whether there is some has an impact. Big policy initiatives of the Senate and House leadership certainly will have an impact, but also the election season. So we're heading into, obviously, a presidential election. We also have 20 senators up for re-election and all 120 House members. There'll be a general election and primary, as you guys know, but let me talk a little bit about what's on the ballot. As you know, no statewide elected officials this time. All members of Congress are up. I've just mentioned a little bit there. Some constitutional amendments to take a look at. There are 26 that have been filed, but in order to get on the ballot, there's a Supreme Court review process, and there's really only a small subset. I'm not even sure it's 8 that I would call as highly active. There's minimum wage, there's expanding Medicaid, that's a typo, it's not Medicare. There's an assault weapons ban, which has been making the news with our local Ashley Moody in the news on that one. There's changing the elections process a couple of different ways, and then there's also medical marijuana. Not sure what all of these are going to make the ballot, because there will be court challenges. If you wanted to know more about each one of those, I can delve into that. The one I was going to say is on elections that appears to be most poised to make the ballot, deals with the requirement that in order to vote in elections, you have to be a U.S. citizen. And I can offer my own commentary on that if you want, but I would suggest that that is put on there to drive voter participation by those who are trying to do that. Let me switch to getting into some of the more granular about what the House and the Senate looks like going forward. So there are 23 members of the House who are either termed out or some are running for other office. You can see those. There are 7 senators who are termed out. So there will be, that will be going on, kind of the backdrop. A lot of these people we know and work with, and there'll be a new group coming in. Let's talk about the delegation. So this is probably where the meat of the discussion could be. Senator Cruz, as I mentioned, has been helpful on the ITS program, and we were fully funded at her request. Senator Rasan put in the money for the stormwater last year, and we will continue to work with him. He's chairman of our delegation. Tom Lee is an extremely influential senator for a couple of reasons, not the least of which he's the former Senate president, which establishes a lot of credibility in the body. And then we have Senator Galvano, who is a member of the Hillsborough delegation. My own opinion is that he's not really seen as a Hillsborough guy, he's really seen as a Sarasota-Bradenton person. As far as our House delegation goes, you can see the list there. Let me flip to the next, there's the map. So, you know, just to give you a feel for where we are, you guys know the county. With the yellow is Cruz, the green is Rusan, Lee is blue, and then pink is Galvano. And then let's talk about the leadership in the Senate from our neck of the woods, so to speak. So you got Senator Simpson, who's a Pasco County-oriented senator. He's the next Senate president. We'll want to continue to develop a relationship with him, though he's not in our delegation. I think it's important that we put him on our list at some point. Senator Rusan, we talked about. Senator Lee, we talked about a plan of you, and I think we'll probably get Governor Bob Martinez on our team engaged in setting up a meeting for you, Ben, and Tom Lee. I think that would be a good idea. Senator President, we talked about it. Senator Rand. Senator Rand is, though he's not from Hillsborough County, he's close by, and he's got a big interest in transportation issues, and he's very approachable and forward-thinking and a doer. So I would recommend that we, and in fact, we are going to go ahead and set up a meeting. Lena's going to do that. So let's talk about the House leadership a bit. So these are the members, in my opinion, from this area who are kind of what I would call in the House leadership sphere, if you had to pick one. So Jamie Grant, he is from Hillsborough County. He is a Republican. The House is more party-centric. Republicans in the House matter, of course. And so Jamie Grant is somebody we definitely have on our list. We will communicate with him. He will be increasingly in leadership as time goes along, as he I'll stop there. Sprouse is from Pinellas County, but the reason Sprouse is, number one, he's from the Bay Area, but number two, he works in Hillsborough County, downtown law firm, Buchanan, Ingersoll, Rooney. So I think that's a natural person we need to get in our organization. Ben met with him last session when he came to Tallahassee. It was a good meeting. We'll continue that. Ben Diamond is a Democratic leader in waiting. He won't be the Democratic leader next session or 2 sessions after that, but will have, I guess, 4 or 5 years after that. Very well-respected guy, thoughtful lawyer, likable fella, and will take the time to learn our issues. And then the last one I want to mention, this is a bit of, I would say, a bit of a sleeper here, but we need to get focused on McClure. McClure was elected in a special election. He's from East Hillsborough County, and he is in the freshman class, which doesn't mean he has a lot of influence today, but he's very close to the guy who won speakership in the freshman class. So as time goes on, McClure will have a larger role in what goes on, and no time like the present to make the connection. Let me just make one footnote here. I guess I'm subject, this is my opinion. You guys are from Hillsborough County, you guys say that you're crazy. So I was asked to put together the Tampa Bay area leadership. So if you look up what is, quote, the Tampa Bay area, you look at the footnote at the bottom of the asterisk, those are the counties that are in the Tampa Bay delegation. I don't think, I'm a native Floridian, and I don't think of all of those counties as Tampa-centric. So my opinion, you're looking at focusing on Hillsborough, Pasco, and Pinellas. So, you know, there are obviously these other counties that claim to be are part of the Tampa Bay delegation, and I want to make that note because there's a lot of influential people from these other counties that are not on my list. So if we want to talk about some of them, that'd be great as well.
I would just say that I think a very strong connection and a place that's really changing is between Hillsborough and Polk County.
Okay.
And that is becoming, I mean, I think of Manatee as in the Sarasota and Hernandez and Citrus, but is too far. But I think the connections with Polk County are becoming very, very heavy, both in terms of land use, jobs, commutes, all that.
So if that's the case, and we can co-opt some of those folks from Polk County and caring about what's happening in HART, we'll want to do that. And we'll go back through the list and double check and see where there are. I mean, I'll give you one off the top of my head. Kelly Stargell, who's a senator from Polk County, is rumored, none of this is said, it's not announced, he's rumored to possibly be the Appropriations Committee chairman under Wilton Simpson. And so Commissioner Kemp, that would be a target for us to want to make sure she understands our issues. And then,
I think there's another comment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick, to add to what Commissioner Kemp just said, generally speaking, I think that, I'm glad that you were comprehensive and included those additional counties. And I say that from a regional standpoint. And for those who aren't aware, Senator Galvano passed the MCORS projects. If you haven't heard of those, they're multi-use corridors of regional economic significance. Google that when you get a chance if you haven't heard of it. And I bring that up because those additional counties, which include, I know Galvano's technically Hillsborough, but he is perceived as Sarasota. I think it'll be important to kind of convey that we're aware of what's happening, not just in our area, but around the state. So I'm glad to see those additional, representatives, and I want to add to what you said. So, keeping them in mind and showing them that we're aware of what's happening regionally and in the state, because the MCORS projects are significant, and they're part of the reason they're significant is because they're going to include transit, and obviously that's our priority. So thank you.
I don't want to get into a political discussion here, but the MCORS to me, just so people know what it is, I mean, anybody watching, the toll roads through the wilderness corridors, so,
Yeah.
and I think it would be a horrible, destructive thing, but anyway, we'll just keep going,
Yeah, just a
Right.
quick comment on that. Again, my comment is kind of agnostic from a political standpoint, just to note that we know what's happening, because they're legislatively mandated projects and funded. So.
all right, we have probably a unforced error in my part. I had a house map also that I wanted to run through with you. I had it here. I kept saying, "Where's the house map?" And it's not in it is not in the one
Was
on the
expecting
computer, but
that.
it's here. But anyway, if we want to talk about the house map and where everyone fits, and I guess the takeaway is that McClure and Beltran are East Hillsborough, and I'll state my prejudice. I typically, East Hillsborough has been less HART-centric than more Western Hillsborough. However, both of those guys I think are worth getting to meet with, and we got them on our plan, and I'll tell you why. I think I already told you about McClure. I'll tell you why Beltran. Beltran is a really smart guy, and he's the kind of guy that will dig into the details and won't be persuaded by logic. So there's a couple of maybe diamonds with Beltran. I think we need to work on that as well. So we will. All right. So next steps, and I want to add one other thing.
Did you want to comment now?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I actually, when I went up last year, I met with Beltran, and he was begging me to give him a transportation project. So he didn't say transit, but he was looking for, something to focus on in the area of transportation, not to exclude transit. And Adam Hattersley has recently filed to run for Congress against Spano, I believe.
Yes.
So that seat may open up and change, but not before we get into this next legislative session. And it's my understanding Fentress Driscoll is actually on the Transportation Committee.
That's right.
Okay, are there any
Subcommittee.
others in the
Hart,
House?
Diane Hart as well,
And Diane Hart as well.
and Hattersley.
And Hattersley,
Yeah.
okay.
They're all on the subcommittee.
Okay, so the reason I'm bringing this up is
recently, Commissioner Kemp and I are both, and I don't know if you are as well, on the TMA for the area. Okay. Well, we're part of the transportation management area. Whichever day I can figure out all the acronyms. But we're on that committee as well. And one of the recent, last meeting, we decided that we needed to, the MPO-AC agreed that it was going to be important that we meet with the delegation and help them understand our sort of regional priorities. That was set for September 6th at 9:30 in the Planning Commission building here in Hillsborough County. And then originally, when I thought we were discussing the delegation, I thought we were meeting with all the delegation. I did recently inquire, and it appears as though Ms. Alden has made the decision or is deciding just to meet with a few. And the key areas and the key individuals they've reached out to so far are Representative Toledo, Roussan, and they're reaching out to Senator Simpson as well. But the House delegation apparently hasn't, I don't know where we are with reaching out with the House. So anywhere we can do, you know, from all angles, come together with a prioritization of our policies and priorities, I think is where they hear it every single day, everywhere along the way. And for that meeting, we want to make sure that HART's priorities are at least discussed at that particular meeting. So I think that's going to be critically important. What was mentioned for that agenda was really the West Shore interchange. Well, yeah, okay. But I want ours listed too. So I just thought, you know, any armament you can give us to help us be best prepared would be really helpful. So I just wanted to share that with you since that wasn't really part of this meeting, but it does overlap.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Now, Hattersley, you know, this is, you know, I'll say it this way. I mean, try to be politically correct about this. He's a freshman, he's a Democrat in a House that's controlled by Republicans. However, who knows, I mean, that district, that congressional district was close. So he's also a very bright guy. If you've not met him, he is in the military, he's a guy who can get into the details and understands complexities. So I think it's time well spent, as Ben and I have discussed, to get to know him, even not necessarily for next session, but who knows what will happen in the congressional campaign.
I happen to know him really well, so.
You agree with what I said?
Yes,
As well as I
absolutely,
do, too.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
just a quick comment, I know you need to finish your presentation, but, you know, to that point, well, first of all, I love your idea of appealing to folks that have, you know, a sense of logic and whether they're, on whether, regardless of the side of the aisle that they're on, you know, and I think that there's a lot of merit to that. And just want to note, you know, regarding, you have a bullet point that says policy requires consensus among allies and partners. And, you know, I think that, well, I just want to make a notation of, you know, I always try to evaluate certainty as as we're going forward. And I just want to note that to me at least, and feel free to ring in, the 2 points of uncertainty that really play into and affect how we move forward and we operate are, well, there are 3. There's obviously the Supreme Court decision. There's Brightline and Tampa Bay Next. And I just want to note those last 2 because I think we need to be aware and also cooperative with our partners. And we really, you know what I'm saying, we need to make sure that we're communicating, and I'm glad to hear your comments, you know, that you're on the TMA. We have to keep these dialogues open so we know what they're doing, what their timing is, and we're kind of at the whim of some of that, right? That certainty has to be established before, and maybe we can hear a little bit more about that if you think that's relevant. Thank you.
Sure. So let me close with this list and then also give you an update on MDX, which is something that came up last night. So this is just a summation of what we've already talked about, but we're going to work with the HART staff to get our legislative agenda together. That will include public policy initiatives and funding. Now, public policy initiative, what I want to explain what I mean by that, one of the worst things you can do is come to Tallahassee with a fractured industry. We want certain things in safety, but our partner in Miami or Orlando wants something different. We got to get, now we can, opposition, we don't have to be in consensus with them. We're going to try to outwork them and convince people that we got the right ideas. And then our funding request, we've talked about having discrete funding requests. It's different from existing grant requests that we have pending, and then a summation of the meetings. Let me close by addressing the NDX situation. If you'll recall from our last meeting, I had reported to you that there was a bill that had passed the legislature and was signed, actually at the time was not signed by the governor, which abolished the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority. And you were interested in knowing about how that was proceeding. So it was signed by the governor. There were lawsuits filed before and after the governor signed it. Long story short is just last week, the Circuit Court Judge John Cooper in Tallahassee ruled that the legislation was unconstitutional as a violation of home rule. Miami-Dade is, and I'm not an expert in home rule to start with, and I'm certainly not an expert in Miami-Dade County home rule. Suffice it to say that Miami-Dade County is an extra special county constitutionally and has maybe more powers home rule wise than the rest of the state. And anyway, the judge said that the home rule constitutional provisions as it applied to Miami-Dade County and NDX were unconstitutional, and he struck the bill. So of course that means that NDX is pleased with that. So that's what that means.
That most certainly will be appealed, correct?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Commissioner Overman.
Thank you. You recently, earlier today, you talked about the veto of the ITS request that we had in last session. Did you have an opportunity to find out what the rationale behind killing that particular allocation?
Yeah, so we did a post-mortem and looked at not only our own situation, but others, and it's in your packet. And we were hoping to be able to, find some trends that maybe Democratic initiatives got vetoed, and that was our problem. It was not. There was a smattering of vetoes from Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, so there was no trend line. And I guess the answer we were given that this was a local project, it should be funded locally with local resources. Now, we could go through this budget and I could show you examples of where there are local projects that are funded locally that were not vetoed.
I think we could probably make another argument that safety is critically important and those programs actually support it. And given the number of pedestrian deaths as well as children at risk that have to walk 2 miles to school, I think we might be able to revisit that issue in a good way. Half of it is the argument, half of it is the understanding. So I look forward to pushing that in the future and maybe expanding it even more so that we understand how critically important it is to our area. So, thank you.
Does anyone else have questions? I have a couple. In terms of the ITS, what is that exactly funding?
So, if I may, the ITS project was an upgrade to our CAD AVL system. AVL stands for Automated Vehicle Locator. It's pretty typical transit infrastructure. What it does is it allows our operations control center to see where all of our fleet are and to make sure that they are running on time, as well as it's linked to our APC system, which is our automated passenger counter. So it's absolutely critical to run on-time operations, as well as be able to collect and analyze ridership data as far as where specifically people are getting on and off the bus. There's several other ways that technology infrastructure goes towards making our transit system sustainable, but some of those are in the weeds, but generally speaking, is key to our sustainable system.
And to answer your comments, kind of back to how you make the argument sometimes, and these are just things that I've thought of. One of the things we've heard in the past, I know we're all going to get sublead, but one of the things we've heard in the past is the hesitancy about having more buses. That's going to create more congestion. That's just going to make things terrible. And so having the ability to have that technology to help our transit system work efficiently and safely through our community is a super opportunity to really make all of our transportation network work well. So I, just sort of in that concept, when I thought about it and then have reframed that conversation, I think that's a valuable opportunity to bring that back to the table. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And what's the total cost of that?
Ruthie or Greg, do you know the total cost off the top of your head? Or Linda?
Yes,
Sorry, I didn't see it back there.
sorry.
Linda Crescentini's Director of Project Management here at HART.
Yes, the CAT AVL is 6 million, currently.
6 million?
So, yes, it's 6 to 8 million.
So would this be like a replacement of some or updating of some of what we have, so we do it gradually?
I think it's a project, Shannon's the project manager for that, but it's a total project. It starts from the beginning and replaces all of the CAT AVL.
I see. Okay.
Upgrade to the current system.
Yes.
I have just a couple other things. I'm glad you asked about the ITS. In terms of, I think the ongoing major need that we have here immediately before anything and everything else is our Operation and Maintenance Center, which I know that this year, instead of having money added to that pot, we had money taken away, as I understand it. So can you, how is that going in the process? I just think that this has to just be our number one focus and priority.
Sure.
I'm not sure who exactly, I know we have, I want to bring it up now that we have our legislative,
It is.
Yes.
And it was.
Mhm.
And that was the project that Representative Toledo advanced for us, and that Senator Rasan advanced for us. And we picked good sponsors. But at the end of the day, there's a finite set of money for both water projects, and it didn't make the cut. We were assured throughout the budgetary process, working with the chairman, Holly Rasheen, and Senator Mayfield, that we were going to be in good shape. But that list has dropped the last of the last of the last, one of the last 9 things that was done. And you're either in or you're out, and we were not in.
I think what is disturbing is that we hear about T-BART is supposed to bring money to the region and help us, and instead it took money from us, $1.5 million from that, and $1 million from PSTA to fund T-BARTA, which has no operations. So I just find that money shift disturbing, and looking at that kind of priority. The other question I have is about funding for regional operations, like many states have, which I think, in Miami, I know that they're funding Tri-Rail at about $50 million a year. Sunrail, they're doing funding for Sunrail for 7 years. And I, know that has, when I went and met with folks in Orlando, they were actually very disturbed, in particular, with T-BARTA, which they felt wasn't playing with other transit funding mechanisms in the state, in particular Miami and Orlando, in terms of all, and Jacksonville, in taking a joint approach to looking for transit operation dollars. So how can we, one, build, I'd like to know how we can build that into, working with the other jurisdictions, how that would work, how we can bring that forward as a policy by the state.
Well, to me, what seems to be the place to go is your trade association. But I spoke to the trade association executive last week, Lisa Bacot, and she says historically they've not put forward, at least certainly not project-oriented funding. I guess you could go for global-oriented funding, and then makes a bigger pot for everybody to apply. That would be the place to go. The natural place to go is to go to your association of like-kind entities, other transit authorities throughout the state, and come up with an initiative to push. And
Okay, I
then
just wanted
individual,
to-
that would be the way to do it, I would think.
Because it seems like there would be strength in doing that we haven't really exercised and worked on. So I just wanted your opinion on that. Are there,
I will follow up with Ben and with Lisa and see what the landscape is as far as trying to do something in that space.
Just a quick comment, Madam Chair. And this relates back to the ITS funding and seeking that funding. The board appointed me to the Transit Disadvantage Coordinating Board, and as well, I know my fellow board members have also seen our constituents that have come before us at many board meetings, the transportation disadvantaged. What are the connections I made by going to the Transportation Disadvantage Coordinating Board and hearing some of the testimonies and seeing what the issues are? The technology piece and being able to communicate to the customer, it's amazing how simple it is, and so giving staff the tools that they need to do that, I think they do a great job. And because one of the issues is vendor accountability, and our staff is doing a great job, and they lay that out and detail that at that board meeting. But on the technology side, anything that supports our staff and our operators in providing good customer service, I know we want to. There's no lack of passion there or desire, but I just want to emphasize how important that is, because at the end of the day, right, that's really what we're about. Is if we're not providing that customer service, if someone has to get kidney dialysis and they miss a van because we're just not able to fund the most, the technology, that's available is amazing. We just have to have the funding to then employ it, and I know staff wants to do that. So I just wanted to emphasize, what I see there. Thank you.
Commissioner?
I just
Director
wanted to
Shannon?
make sure, I know we have two elected members of this panel, but the importance of politics. Bill Galvano is the sponsor of T-BARTA. So I think you've got to be sophisticated enough to understand that there's a policy driver in a lot of these areas, but there's an overlay of politics always in the history of organizational management, at least as long as I've been involved in the state of Florida and frankly nationally. So appreciation for that in commentary around goals of another organization that you're trying to advocate for, without disenfranchising one where the Senate President is the sponsor and he follows it very closely, I think is important. I don't mean you have to, obfuscate your policy views, but I think, I'm a big believer in if you find a cause, and I think we have a cause, a justified cause with the partnership with the union, with the recent tragedy that we suffered, that 3 other counties, significant counties in the state have suffered, to move forward some of these pieces of legislation. I don't agree with all the politics in Tallahassee. In fact, I think it's on many days disgusting. But I'm also a realist in terms of how it all works. And he is the Senate President. He was the sponsor of T-BARTA. And so people before him and after him are also going to believe in T-BARTA. And on a piece of paper, T-BARTA speaks to the 7 or 9 counties, I don't know what's in it now, and the importance of, sort of advocating for policy in that area. And I think that, we as an organization should be seen as trying to work with all these people on a mission that benefits us. But if we're seen as being anti all of them and only for us, you create discord, and that's why ITS bills get vetoed. I'm telling you, I know probably more about the ITS bill than I care to know. I also am a big believer in the politics of the strength of the Hillsborough County footprint and what we represent statewide to anybody that's going to run statewide. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, and I don't think we leverage that enough. I've said that ever since I've sat on this board. And I think there's ways to do that, and I think it's a smart, sophisticated conversation. And I think many of those members that you had listed out are looking at statewide, whether it's now or in the future. And I think you got to be really, really focused on what are our top 2 or 3 priorities and go sell it to everybody. I mean, the governor's staff should be on the agenda of who we're meeting with on a regular basis and briefing them. He wants to run for re-election. I frankly would cover the other elected statewide. They all have a reach in terms of the conversation of the budgeting process up in Tallahassee. And, Hillsborough County matters. I don't care what anybody says. In this state, Hillsborough County is one of the top 3 states you got to win. So I think that, I think we were late to the game, as we've been late to the game, I think ever since I've been on this board. And I think we're getting more strategic. I thought this was a very good presentation. I think there's other people I would add to the list, and I would get started now.
I think Commissioner Overman.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with what you've said in so many ways. One of the things that I observed, I recently went to Jacksonville for the APTA conference that focused on board member training and board administrative roles and the innovation in the transit industry. I wasn't able to stay for the entire conference, but what my biggest takeaways was the importance of board members' primary job, I mean literally primary job, is to advocate on behalf of the agency. And to talk with our state legislators and talk with our federal legislators and talk with our fellow agencies in this effort to create economic opportunity through the use of transit and transportation investing. It was very enlightening to learn of the tools that APTA offered to assist us in having an argument or making an argument on behalf of this agency, because they have tools that basically show you every single legislator's district, that shows them every single employer in their district where they are part of the economic driver, where they have companies that produce parts, that produce part of the process, that are part of the engineering, part of all of the wonderful things that have, as complex as transit planning is, all of those companies that create opportunity and jobs in each of their districts to make a case for why investing in infrastructure that supports transit is so critically important. So that was one of my major takeaways, and I thought we really need to know how to use that tool in every conversation that we meet with any part of our legislative bodies. Mm-hmm. Two, the second thing I noticed, because it was a national conference, is how awesome HART is. And we don't say that enough. Mm-hmm. We do focus on areas that we need to improve because that's why we're that awesome. Because we're constantly trying to be better. But I don't know that our legislative body knows that. I think it's critically important that when we speak of the mission of HART and the effort of HART and the excellence of HART and how it's functioned as well as it has on the pennies it's gotten over the decades is strikingly amazing. So the return on investment for the dollars that this agency has produced is well worth the investment. And we need to make that argument to our federal legislators as well as our state legislators. So I would like to highly recommend that we spend a lot of time with our board members training them on how to be our best advocate. Because I think that's part of a board initiation to begin with, but not everybody's good at it. A lot of people can be if we spent some time learning how to be. And we have along the primary list of our priorities so we don't get off track. And those priorities are put into such a way that they do work with our partners in the mission of helping families and owners and businesses and people function in a community as they get around. I'm very proud of this agency. I really am. I'm very glad of what we're doing. And I need every single person in Tallahassee to know that. So anything you guys can do to help us be best ready when we go visit, or as these other meetings come up, that we're best prepared to have the talking points that we need to stay on track and make sure that we're mentioning those things that are in alignment with the work that you're doing as our representatives in Tallahassee on a daily basis. I think it would be really helpful for the entire board to have that information, even though there may not be everyone here. So, thank you.
So can I ask a question, Commissioner Kemp, Commissioner Overman? Two things. One, in the materials that you went to that national group on, did they have some collateral materials that you can share with us that talked, I mean, it's already pre-designed messaging about the importance of public transit? And, you know, I think we've talked about this before. You know, one of the things that there's many good reasons that we invest as a society in public transit, but one of the reasons is you can get the workforce to the employers.
Yes.
So they can do the job at the job site. And that kind of a message, that particular one, there's many messages, but that one will resonate with the people that run Tallahassee, right?
Yes,
So-
I do have all of the
So that would be good to
presentations.
have, so we don't have to recreate the wheel, and that would be great. And the other thing is, you mentioned the comparative, the comparative success of HART or stature of HART relative to other. Is there some type of data that we can point to that also, that would be another one to work into our baseline messaging, because I think that's powerful. Those are two powerful things that I would like to.
Most of what I heard was anecdotal,
Okay.
as we talked about opportunities, and the things we were doing as compared to other agencies and where we were in the process. However, I'm sure we can find that data.
Yeah.
I'm sure we can find it. So.
We are actually preparing, I worked for years on that APTA mapping database.
It is
as you saw.
amazing, I love
Yes.
that, yeah.
It's pretty neat. We are putting together some background data about our economic and our operational performance, as well as our overall impact to the state of Florida in job creations and where we purchase goods and services. So we're putting all of that information together. You know, it's a lot of data, so we're working quickly, but it will take a little time. But we'll certainly send that to this group as well as the whole board once we get it all put together.
Well, the reason I bring that up, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Because I wanted to just, you can.
The reason I bring it up is previously the whole HART board has brought up asking HART staff and administration to evaluate and begin the process of determining the best opportunity available for utilizing the CSX lines. And while we're still in the infancy stages of probably moving forward on that, and we may have next month an agenda item to at least start the conversations and exploration, the previous presentation on, you know, the timeline on starts made it pretty obvious that the longer we wait, the more the larger the percentage that we will have to come up with in terms of funding, given that the trend has been that the federal matching is declining. And because the longest timeline of the presentation of transit versus BRT was in the area of rail opportunities, I think it's critically important that we evaluate that as quickly as possible and bring that beginning stages of a process to the conversation, because that is a regional project. That's a project of regional significance. And I don't, in one of the conversations I've had with the new T-BARTA representative is that he was very eager to start that conversation. So I think we can shift where we're going with the resources that are available on a regional level and focus on what we can do on a local level, given we have the information and we start moving forward on it. But the timeline is a little frightening in terms of how long it takes to get a rail project moving and funded. So I'm eager to see what we can do over the next few months at addressing that issue.
Just to address actually just exactly what you said, the Sunrail in Orlando was able to get from start to finish in 8 years, and 3 of that was spent in contract negotiations with the state, which we now have a model for. So that is about, I think, the fastest possible conversion. The tracks already exist. It was, again, about $20 million a mile, way far lower. And this is exact figures from Sunrail, and that was for everything in terms of the right-of-way and conversion and the stations and locomotives. But that being said, I have spent time in Tallahassee. I think I very well understand, but I also think that we shouldn't remain silent about when dollars are taken or not given, and we have a responsibility to advocate for this, for how we get people to work, what we do here, and to look at resources for this. We're going to be the ones with the matching dollars should this go through, and I think to look at how we can best deploy those dollars on a local and regional level, and that's extremely important, and also pairing with other agencies around the state and sharing those needs and looking at those needs. So, you know, Tallahassee has their term limits, they're in and out, they're different things, but over the years, we've been a decade with really not getting resources to HART over and over again. And so I think it's important not to ignore that, not to, and you know, that we need to advocate in a strong way that we haven't been doing. And we have to advocate for HART and for those dollars for Hillsborough County.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just two quick comments, very briefly. Well, three. I'll just leave you with this phrase: workforce development. I'll let you guys figure that one out. Second, I would like to commend Ms. Shanahan for her comments on the political side. I think that political savvy is just as important as having savvy on the financial side and the policy side. I mean, and I respect you have the experience, and I appreciate it, and I'm aware of it, and it's an asset to this committee, and I think that we have an obligation to the board as the members of this committee to be as politically savvy as we possibly can, and have that awareness, and in the vein of working with our allies and partners, we have to tread carefully. We really do. So thank you for emphasizing that. And then lastly, just one quick note that kind of plays into that is, from feasibility, political feasibility and financial feasibility. Mr. Booth covered the federal side, and I would encourage the committee members, and maybe we could even talk about it at the board, to look at the makeup of the pipeline and those projects, and what are they? You saw how many BRT projects were in small starts. So as we consider candidate projects and options, it has to be financially and politically feasible. And thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. Appreciate it.
You're excellent.
So I think we're finished here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll next go to understanding ridership trends in transit.
Good morning. I'll try and keep this fairly quick. I've got a lot of material here. I'll leave it for you to have and go over in more detail as time permits. We're not on the screen yet. There we go. I'm going to share with you some information that's based on some work that I did when I was at the University of South Florida. It's information on ridership analysis. It was funded predominantly by FDOT, but it's a topic area that I've been involved in for several years, and the material's been presented fairly widely across the country. There are additional resources on our website at Qatar, also on FDOT website for your reference. I'm now with USDOT. They've been kind enough to let me continue to present this material at a few locations, but this is prior work and shouldn't be interpreted as reflecting any US DOT policy information. I'm going to click through some things. A few of you have seen a fair amount of this. I did refresh it with some new information, but this is the history of what's happened in public transportation. We went through a period in the 2012 to 2014, where all the news was good news. People were excited about transit. In the recession, ridership had picked up some, and BMT had declined. Developers and communities were excited about transit, and things were pretty positive. And then we hit a peak about 2014, 2015 in most properties across the country. And in the next 3 and now 4 years, the trends have not been friendly to public transportation. A lot of reasons for that. Millennials were aging out into more traditional characteristics of mid-career and started buying cars and relocating. System condition was a problem in a number of cases with both crime, homelessness, etc., that were intimidating and scaring away riders. There were safety issues, both personal safety and accident safety in some of the older systems. Significantly, transportation network companies, Ubers and Lyft, were starting to, in effect, take away transit ridership. Originally, we thought of them as a nice first mile, last mile connection, and then discovered that while they did that in some places, in practical sense, about twice as much, they were stealing passengers away from public transit. And then we also had this period where the media took a significant interest in automated vehicles, and it started to cast some doubts and raise some questions about the merits of and uncertainties about the long-term situation for public transportation. 2018 was a rough year. This was a June article from Governing Magazine talking not only about the ridership trends, but also the challenges that were faced in a number of communities in terms of some of their expansion plans with pricing and other challenges to those plans. This is long-term historical data on transit ridership. The red line is the ridership trend nationally over a long history. The blue line right below it is ridership per capita. Again, this is national total. Ridership had been growing generally since about the mid-70s, about the time when the U.S. government started to get more involved in public transportation, with some fits and starts, often following economic cycles. What was perhaps unique about the recent downtrend is it was in the midst of a robust economy, record employment growth, and those are situations where you traditionally think of people as traveling more, and yet transit was struggling. And the struggle was relatively ubiquitous across the country. This is a trend of, the top line is service supply, and the bottom line is ridership. And the first retort when people talk about transit ridership declines is, oh, well, that's because we're not expanding service. The reality is we've been expanding service, again, nationally, quite aggressively. This is, you can see a slight tick down in 2018, but generally supply has been growing throughout the time period. And if you adjusted it for vehicle size to account for the number of new rail vehicles and the shift of ridership to rail, these trends would be exaggerated even more. So the fact that ridership has declined in spite of the general growing trends in service availability. These are the individual reference years. This is the U.S. ridership trend. You can see 2014 was the last year where ridership was trending up, and it's been trending down relatively systematically since that point in time. Nationally, we're down about 8% over those 4-year period, and in Florida, that number's a couple times that percent. This is HART ridership. HART was a little bit unique in that the ridership growth was sustained through 2015 in HART, but then started declining and accelerated its decline through most of 2018. This is the month-over-month comparative data for HART. This was through December, calendar year December of last year. And you can see that the blue bars that are the 2018 numbers started showing positive ridership trends year over year in about September. of last year. I haven't looked at them so far this calendar year for HART, but this is a powerful way to look at data. It gives you a good sense of what's going on, and there are things like storms and other things that you can pick out in the data to explain individual anomalies in the trends, but this is a way to present the data that I recommend. It's easy for folks to interpret and understand what's been going on. This is national data and some overall travel trends. The top list of rows in this table are kind of the key things that drive travel demand: population growth, job growth, GDP, gas price, registered vehicles, light vehicle sales, zero-car households. And the bottom numbers are the trends by kind of mode technology. You can see the red row there is public transit. Couple of data sources, that's why there's two numbers in those cells. But generally, transit's been the mode that's most significantly been declining. The strongest mode has been airline travel that's shown robust upward growth over time. This is data, and I did update this. I added 2018 data since a few of you saw it at the APTA Board Members Summit. And this shows a couple of things. One is the changes in ridership are relatively ubiquitous, almost across the country uniformly. There's a few different properties. Seattle has been the single largest outlier with massive investment and also massive central business district growth. They have been able to skirt the declines. Almost every place else has suffered. Denver was slightly positive, but recent headlines showed them down double digits so far this calendar year. Houston is positive through that 4-year period. They did some redesign and reinvestment, but almost without exception, north, south, east, west, new cities, old cities, rail cities, non-rail cities, big cities, small cities, etc. Folks have suffered on the ridership trend. This data is for metropolitan areas, so you'll see Tampa's got Tampa, St. Pete, and Pasco combined in this particular graphic. Miami's got Miami and Broward combined. I will note that South Florida is tops in the list in terms of pace of decline. What would arguably be our best served and most compelling transit market has also suffered the most in terms of ridership. Here's the individual property data for Florida properties. This is calendar year data pulled from national data sets. These do tend to get updated and revised, sometimes retroactively by folks as they find things like counters weren't working or data was miscoded or something like that. So sometimes you'll not be able to completely replicate the data, but the trends are powerful and systematic, and it gives you a good idea of what's going on. Part of the differential performance of Florida was what motivated FDOT to sponsor the study, and we spent over a year looking at a whole host of factors, and again, that report's available on our website as well as FDOT's, and there's multiple webinar presentations as well. But again, some startling numbers, very significant trends. One of the questions that I talked to about some colleagues in the industry, are we done yet? Are we at the bottom? Have we turned around, et cetera? How much more might this trend play out? We're pretty positive. Nationally, we seem to be up about 1% for calendar year 19 through the first 4 months. As an industry, that looks good, and that's consistent with some of what I'll speak to and some of the causal factors. This is some commuting data. In the interest of time, I'll go through it relatively quickly, but you can see transit, bike, walk, carpool, everything has declined a little bit. So drive alone, single occupant vehicle has been stable, and work at home has been the big growth factor. And that's a significant factor. When I presented this information at one forum, a fellow from the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Board came up to me and said, 18% on Fridays and 10% on Sunday or on Mondays is the telecommute effect on their ridership. Just so it just gives you an idea of the magnitude of that impact. This is some of the kind of concept and logic we use when we analyze the data. We looked at demand factors and supply factors, both for transit and for, quote, the competition to transit. One of the things that everybody always wants to know is how come? And of course, these are complex multi-factor decisions, and we don't really have robust enough data set to completely diagnose this, but this is a graph that I put together based on judgment and not heavy quantitative analysis. But this lists all of the things that have been known to influence ridership and changes in transit ridership. And both my work and work of a number of colleagues across the country confirm that the single largest factor, and perhaps a majority of all ridership loss, is simply associated with increased auto availability. Now that's a little bit of a chicken or an egg. Did they, get an auto to quit riding transit, or quit riding transit and then get an auto, and what other factors influence that? And a number of us have looked in that in greater detail, and gas price, used car prices, low interest rates, generously available credit, a number of factors are responsible for that. A number of states have allowed undocumented immigrants to get driver's license. That spurred auto ownership in a number of places and impacted transit ridership, et cetera. That this gives you kind of a crude sense. I will note that across the country, there's very real differences depending on the location. There are some systems that have had accidents, and safety is a big factor. Others have more serious crime and homelessness and untenable conditions that are scaring away riders in certain environments, et cetera. There are places that have declined service or raised fares. So there's a host of conditions across the country. It's not the exact same set of factors. This is a little more data on the vehicle availability. Nationally, we're at a record low in terms of the number of households that have no car. In spite of some urban renaissance and some CBD-centric residential growth that's high profile in a number of metropolitan areas, the fact of the matter is there's the smallest number of households without cars that's existed since we began collecting data. Florida has even fewer cars in that, or households in that category. Most of those households are single-person elderly adults, often with conditions that make their inability to drive and/or other factors that limit their travel. There's a number of reasons: medical, legal, financial, and simply a choice. We certainly do have cities or people in some of the metropolitan regions that choose not to have a vehicle. I'm up in DC most of the time, and I don't have a vehicle up there. It's the logical solution in some of those environments. This shows the kind of the compelling story here of how people behave based on the number of vehicles that are available in the household. If you've got no vehicles in the household, people make 230 trips on transit annually. If you've got one vehicle, it drops down to 30 or 38 to 40 for two different reference year data sets. Drops down even more if there's two vehicles in the household. So if the vehicle's available, people tend to use it in lieu of public transportation. And so this is a huge and powerful factor that single-handedly explains a very significant share of the decline in transit ridership across the country. Another factor that doesn't get as much attention is the second one here. This is trip making. This is the rate of travel. People have been traveling less over the past few decades for a number of reasons. There's a little bit of an aging effect, but most of it is communication substitution for travel. It's e-commerce, it's distance learning, it's using DocuSign, it's banking online. It's a whole bunch of those kinds of considerations, including telecommuting, and people are traveling less. And And they're foregoing onerous urban trips, and when they are traveling, they're doing long-distance social recreation, vacation, trips to the beach, etc., but foregoing urban travel to the extent that they can. That alone is a powerful factor. We've got another report that I worked on that should be coming out of Qatar fairly soon, that looked at some of the other characteristics from the National Household Travel Survey. We've got an interesting and significant, from my perspective on the policy side, phenomenon occurring. We've got a polarization in income of transit ridership. We've always had strong ridership in low-income segments of the population, but a lot of the newer services, the CBD-centric services, the airport services, the services to sports venues, arenas, convention centers, etc., are attracting higher income white-collar workers, and we're finding that our services aren't necessarily competitive for middle-class working folks with busy schedules and multi-trips and children and parents, etc., to take care of. So that has some, in my opinion, significant implications in terms of policy and pricing, and even in the politics and public perception of public transportation. This is just some data. As people age, they travel less, and as they age, they use transit less. So the theory that people are going to age and quit driving and start using transit just isn't borne out by the facts. By the time they lose the ability to drive, they're not in a position most often to transition to use traditional fixed route services. They'll either be dependent on family members or paratransit style services for the most part. So that theory that the aging baby boomers will save transit isn't going to play out. This is a broader national demographic trend. The table on the left-hand side is the top 10 areas that have growing population, growing population, and you'll notice at the bottom of the far column there, transit commuting shares average about 3.4%. The national average is 5%. The right-hand side is the table of the communities that are shrinking. And those are communities that generally have much higher transit use. So we do continue to have migration from the north and Midwest to the south and west. In the south and west, transit isn't as mature, transit use isn't as great, land uses aren't concentrated to the same extent, etc. So we are moving people from transit-intensive, well-served areas to areas that are more challenged to provide competitive public transportation. That's a piece as well of the national trend. Transit continues through all the data sets to be slower in the neighborhood of about half the speed on average as driving. And this is a detailed table, probably tough to see. You can print it out and look at it. The red highlighted cells on the right-hand side are the Florida communities. The last column shows the percent of jobs that are accessible on public transit within an hour relative to the percent of jobs that are accessible to the average person by car within these metro areas. This is a detailed analysis that the University of Minnesota did based on detailed census data and roadway and transit networks for metropolitan areas across the country. And as you can see, Florida is not particularly competitive, and the reason that people have cars and use them is pretty obvious. It affords them opportunities to a much larger variety of locations and choices. And Florida, with our both dispersed land use patterns and dispersed distribution of activities, as well as our modest to poor transit service levels, compound the challenge. But even in the best cities, it's very difficult to be competitive. I've commented on most of this. A lot of times folks ask about automated vehicles and what that means. We've kind of come to a pause. The media was quite a frenzy on and high expectations for real near time frame automated vehicles. In the last year or two, expectations have been damped in terms of time frame. There is no question we're still moving down that path, but it's looking more and more like those vehicles will first be deployed in rideshare services, ride-hailing services, and that it'll be incremental in communities over the next several years before they're ubiquitous, and that time frame for when they may be ubiquitous, depending on who you ask, can be from years to decades away, but nonetheless, we're definitely moving in that direction. I tell the folks in that industry that moving people isn't the same as moving packages. It's much more challenging. This is my favorite picture there was a HART picture with, you'll notice someone taking a Christmas tree home on the bus in that photo. And it just shows the real world of public transit and the challenges of moving people. A lot of the investor equity in automated vehicles and TNCs is really a kind of logistics and financial interest, and they sometimes don't appreciate a lot of the nuances of moving people, and so it's not simple going forward. This is some data on TNCs, which is transportation network companies. That's the generic term that the industry uses to characterize Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing services. There's two rows in the table. The one is how many folks use TNCs to connect to transit, and the row below it is how many use TNCs instead of transit. You can see that in general, there's more people using TNCs instead of transit. Where TNCs are most complementary to transit is if you have real strong long distance commutes to central business districts where they charge $50 a day to park a car, and then a $5 or $10 TNC trip to access a station to downtown, where you have a lengthy transit trip that's very affordable comparatively, becomes very attractive. Less so in other communities. TNCs in terms of, remember the average bus trip is about 4 to 5 miles long. You're not going to do a connection on one or both ends. That the economics aren't compelling. You generally need a longer transit trip for TNC to be a competitive access mode. So in a lot of these communities, folks use it instead of transit, and they've done surveys, and it's like, the weather was horrible today, so I used TNC instead, or I was running late and didn't want to take a chance, so I used TNC instead. Some of that, you'll see some late night when frequencies are bad, people will use TNCs instead, or if they've got 2 or 3 people traveling together to split the TNC fare. Transit fares they're not group priced, so the competitive positions changes, etc. Interestingly, the 9 cities that have the top 70% of all TNC trips are those top 9 cities, and those same cities have 72% of transit trips. So those markets are very synergistic, places that are expensive to have a car, tend to have high density. Those are good transit markets, but they're also good markets for TNC. So there's been a fair amount of competition in those communities. We're also seeing things like bikes, e-bikes, scooters, etc. Washington, D.C. is looking at seated electric scooters, moped-type vehicles. 3 companies will be trying those in that city. Madison, Wisconsin's fighting about raising the electric bike speed limit from 17 to 25 to make it more competitive for commuting. So there's a lot of things going on around the country. These modes they can be complementary, but they can also be competitive as well. A lot of times if you take a commute transit vehicle to downtown, maybe you would have used to wait for catch catch a circulator bus to get to your final destination. Now you might take a scooter or bike instead, et cetera. So you might lose a trip segment on transit because of these services as well. And talk a little bit about what transit needs to do to respond. This reflects some of my own perspective on this from working in the industry for about 40 years now. The goal isn't to preserve the institutions or the technologies. We need to think beyond that. We're not going to turn the clock back and get rid of the technologies that have happened, and we're unlikely to be able to convince the world to remake the world the way we see fit. So the challenge and the opportunity really is to make sure that the public purposes that public transit pursues, those continue to be met going forward into the future, and I'll touch on some of those. Obviously, we need safety net services for those without travel options. It is a growing need. We've got baby boomers reaching retirement. We've got new generations with fewer siblings, fewer offspring, et cetera, less people to rely on for folks as they lose their own mobility, more likely to be looking for public sector and institutional services to meet those mobility needs. This is a need that's got broad public support, bipartisan support. Folks realize it's important, and the challenge to the industry is figuring out cost-effective ways to do that, to leverage technology to do that. The second general comment is putting competitive services in markets where transit can provide a resource-effective means of travel. I offer a little bit of caution here. For choice travelers, competitiveness is important. And it is, and you need to have something that works for them, a combination of factors: reliability, safety, cost, convenience, accessibility, et cetera. But you need to be very careful in understanding your markets. There are some folks that are really putting a lot of attention in attracting choice travelers, but if that means they're hurting opportunities for historic transit-dependent travelers, they need to be careful about that. Streamlining services, cutting stop frequency, et cetera, are nice. They speed up services. But if they mean you take the bus further away from the apartment complex that had a lot of old folks that aren't particularly keen on walking a few extra blocks, you just need to be very careful, and detailed route-specific planning needs to occur. You have to be careful about chasing choice riders and not hurting your core markets of folks that need transit as you do that. This is a graph that relates the components of transit trips to the tools and factors that the industry has at its available to itself to influence them. A normal transit trip nationally is about 55 minutes. It's comprised of access and egress time of about 20 minutes, wait time of about 10 minutes, and in-vehicle time of about 25 minutes. That's, again, national average. And so when we think about making transit more competitive, we think about each of those components of the trip and what we might do to it to adapt it and adjust it to be more attractive to travelers. And you can see access egress, obviously, route alignment, route density, stop spacing, land use around transit, et cetera, the extent to which we have bike walk networks, do we have TNC services, do we have parking drop-off, et cetera. All of those things can affect access and egress, the network of biking, walking, et cetera. If you look at wait time's influenced by the frequency and headway, but also by the reliability. You need that reliability to have predictable, otherwise your average wait time, even for a 10-minute frequency, if you have poor headway reliability, the average wait time starts creeping up because of that. The network design, are you going directly between folks' origins and destinations, or are the routes circuitous and require multiple transfers? If you force more transfers, you up the wait time. And finally, the customer information. If you've got apps that tell you when the bus is coming, you can lead people to optimize their travel and perhaps at least be out of the weather a little bit longer, perhaps productive before they can, so they can time their departure to the stop in the best way for them, so they're not incurring as much wait time. The in-vehicle speed obviously is the speed. Exclusive right-of-way certainly is important there. Any kind of preferential treatments, the route directness, the network structure, again, transferring and circuity, and how you handle fares and bikes and mobility aids, etc., things that impact dwell time and allow the bike or the bus to move quickly through its route. All of those things influence in-vehicle travel time. This is a graph, one that the transit folks cringe when I show it, and it looks at, you know, how good does service need to be to attract choice travelers. And the arguments here are that for people that have alternatives, they really don't start to get excited about the prospect. They don't consider transit a competitive alternative unless you've got pretty darn good headways. And I drew a bar there at about 12-minute headways. That's a, you know, it's a judgment number. There's no precision. Every individual's going to be a little bit different. But that's about the area where people start to think about, well, I can walk out and catch the vehicle. I don't really need to worry about the schedule, for example, and it can be an attractive and competitive mode. The challenge of having that high quality of service that becomes competitive to folks is that you need big markets. You need dense markets to provide enough total population to fill up that many vehicles. And that's the challenge that the lower density dispersed areas have. If we could have the good service, we'd attract more folks, but we wouldn't necessarily have enough folks to fill up the vehicles and make it cost-effective service. So it's a challenge to position your services across the spectrum of needs and based on your own particular market. You know, this isn't necessarily how we wish it were, but this is a empirical reality of how people behave. So we need to be careful, use fixed route transit where it works. Finally, the third thought here is, and this is a Tampa specific, a Florida specific comment. We need to think about providing a high quality transit corridor as a part of a portfolio of community type choices that metropolitan areas offer. In other words, we're not necessarily saying that every investment we make is going to pencil out in terms of cost effectiveness, et cetera, but as an area boasts and tries to compete for business and residents, there are certain segments of the population that very much like an urban lifestyle, just like some folks like living on beaches and golf courses and horse ranches and suburban neighborhoods. Others like an urban choice, and it behooves communities of a certain size to offer that choice so that folks with those aspirations can find an urban area that they like to live in or locate their business in. Again, some of those may not pencil out as competitive to dense big city services, but they're an important part of your community to offer that. This is a graph that I stuck in here. I've got a series of them along these points in longer versions of this, but this was an analysis that we looked at. The bus occupancy required to equal the BTU efficiency of an electric car. Remembering that on average a bus in the U.S. is operating with about 9 passengers in it at any given point in time. Averaged all in 9 to 10, depending on which year data you look at. And you can see that if we have an electric bus, you still need 12 people in it to be as efficient as an electric car. In a hybrid bus, you need 17 people. In a CNG bus, 26. Standard coach, 23. So we need to fill the vehicles up if we're going to make the arguments that from a resource perspective, we're an efficient mode. I pasted in a couple of graphs here. Some of these are quite dated, but these really speak to some of the challenges of transit in the Tampa area. This is a population distribution with dots, and these are jobs, and as you can see, they're spread out all over everywhere. This is a simple analysis done with an online tool. The yellow circle there is West Shore, and the dots represent the residential locations of people that work in West Shore. Again, when you think of this as a tool for service planning, you can see the challenges of dispersed residential destinations and the challenge that creates in service planning. Here's some cross-bay analysis. We've done a lot of work on this over the years. I have a fair amount of data in place. This looks at, and I've got the counter pair as well, but the left-hand side is Pinellas County. It's the home location of workers that work in Hillsborough County. So you can see they're all spread throughout Pinellas County. And on the right-hand side is the job location of workers that live in Pinellas County and commute to Hillsborough County. And you can see they're spread all over the place as well. So needless to say, a challenge, complex, almost inevitable that you would have multiple transfers to connect those across the bay. This is a graph that I had a student do probably a decade ago when folks were talking about how we can make the region more accessible. I said, just bring in some heavy equipment and we'll do a little remodeling. And the reason I do that is because oftentimes we're tempted to compare our metropolitan area to other metropolitan areas across the country. And we've got 400 square miles of Tampa Bay right in the middle. Makes it much more challenging to provide at least multi-county connections if we were developed in the area in more characteristic of a monocentric area. Just think we'd have the Gateway and West Shore combined into downtown Tampa Bay, you know, would be lots of jobs, big enough to support better transit, etc. But just for fun. Anyway, we need to find some ways to make things work. We need to leverage technology, but we need to continue to think about being resource efficient and money efficient as we do that. This is the long-term trend of HART monthly ridership going back to the year 2000. And this is the years that I was a board member, pasted on there. Now, I've got one of these for each of you, and I've also got one for all of the executive directors that serve the agency. Just a couple of comments. You know, if you watch businesses, you know, every quarter we get the quarter report to stockholders and earnings and profits, etc. I really encourage you to pay attention to ridership. This business is about ridership. Yeah. The benefits that we accrue to the community, economic benefits, environmental benefits, mobility benefits, they really all need ridership to be realized. So do pay attention to it. Do make sure it's visible. Understand what's going on. Obviously, lots of factors are beyond your control, and we recognize that. They're external environmental factors. But don't for a minute think that this is just about spending money and building stuff. It isn't. You got to figure out how to move people, or you won't accomplish as much as you think. With that, I'll take a few questions, as much as you have time for. Glad to have an opportunity to share some stuff that we've done over the years here with you.
Director Melendez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Polzini, thank you for coming today.
Sure,
and
appreciate it.
Yeah, also thank you, or congratulations, I should say, on your new role with the U.S. Department of Transportation. That sounds exciting. It's good to see you back, and I love the way you called attention to the rise in ridership during your tenure. So I'm not going to point out the specific years that I've served on the board and what that trend looks like, but I will say I'm glad that you noted there are factors outside of our control that contribute.
Yeah, I did have a discussion with one of your prior board members, and I did acknowledge that I know the difference between correlation and causality.
Right,
so.
right. Amen to that. But thanks again. And I very quickly, I just want to point out, thinking of like a three-legged stool, I mentioned, two factors earlier, and I think you really covered the third. There's, as far as projects and our direction, there's political feasibility, financial feasibility, and I think you really covered the third leg of the stool, which is ridership. Because you can build it, but what does that ridership look like? And I think you've really challenged us today to look at reality. It's encouraging to see that if anything, we're not alone in the ridership challenges we faced. One of the things I did really quick while you were talking was, I loved your slide that showed there was a gentleman that had done a correlation between that 70%, and those metro areas that have 70% of transit ridership, and the correlation between TNC or transportation networking companies. If I'm not going to go through them all, but if you go back and look at those numbers, Boston, Chicago, LA, the major metros, there are some significant drops, and they really correlate. I was looking at the history of Uber, that's just one company, but they really launched and really, they launched in New York, and they really kind of took hold in 2014.
Right.
Do you have any further comment on that? I mean, is there a direct?
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's important to know. There were some early analyses done by some colleagues that looked at 2010 forward and said, Uber Lyft wasn't a big deal. And I said, no, it was a big deal. You need to look at the right time frame. Now, having said that, to some extent, the Uber Lyft effect has played itself out. In other words, it went from no Uber Lyft to now people having another choice. That choice is relatively ubiquitously available in metro areas. In some ways, it's getting less competitive because their prices have gone up significantly, and they're arguably destined to continue to go up as they strive towards profitability, and more communities are looking at adding on taxes and minimum wages and et cetera, potentially additional regulatory burden for TNC companies. So I think their effect in terms of, I don't think they'll drive any further decline in transit ridership in cities that have good TNC services today. There are probably some smaller communities where the quality of TNC services has gotten a little bit better, and they may continue to see some suffer and decline in ridership. A little bit will depend on the pricing of TNCs going forward, but I don't think they'll take new market from transit. And I think that's part of the stabilization. We've got through the cheap cars and the low price gas and the TNC, and to some extent the telecommuting. So a lot of these factors that have undermined ridership have played themselves out, but they haven't gone away. So the challenge, they're not going to go away. We're, absent a recession that makes car ownership onerous or something like that. The technology's here to stay. A lot of the micromobility, the scooters and e-bikes, and those things are here to stay. So we'll continue to have to compete with those with transit, but I don't see any of those threats as continuing to undermine. Now, the vehicle availability can. We've looked at some data, and when is our saturation, and how many more cars might be absorbed by households where it was an income constraint, and now a better employment, and that's an issue. There are something like 13 states that I said have made auto licenses available to undocumented folks. I know that was in the legislature in Florida this past year. That in California, they say an additional 1 million licenses were issued after that. And California had huge ridership losses in transit. So, something like that could continue to play perhaps in Florida. And there may be new threats. The technology side of things is, every time we turn around, there's some new technology concept out there. So I'm not saying those threats are over, but I think the big impact has played itself out. But climbing back is going to be a real challenge. It just is, because there's more choices out there. And the one thing I do caution folks is, people have chosen other things because it improves their quality of life. They're better off. We're frustrated in the sense of the transit industry, but those folks are better off. I mean, they pick those because they work better for them. So in terms of overall mobility, the world's gotten better for a lot of folks.
Thank you for that, and just a quick follow-up. I love your slide and your statement about provide a high-quality transit corridor as part of the portfolio of community choices. You know, I think that's important, and I think you've given us some great data today so that we can better evaluate what that portfolio looks like, and thank you.
And of course, the challenge on that is, one, you're not rationalizing it as saving the world in terms of environment or something else. You're saying that that's a prudent economic investment for your community, but you're also saying that not your whole community is going to get that. So it creates an equity challenge. You know, if you make a commitment to a corridor or two that are going to be urban corridors with good transit, that means there's some other corridors that aren't going to have that, then you'll need to deal with that equity issue in the broader portfolio of transportation investments.
Great, thank you very much.
Commissioner Overman?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually got to see it again. Thank you.
Yes.
Although I like your ads, those are really excellent, or additions rather. I think you're one of the most, there's two really very important slides. The one that discussed comparative employment accessibility makes it very obvious that the Tampa area in general, being ranked number 21, the rankings here indicates we're creating tons of jobs, we're looking good. However, we're ranked 38 or closer to the bottom when it comes to accessibility via transit. And that's, I don't think that has a lot to, some of it has to do with the size of our network and our ability to provide the services in an efficient manner that allows people to make transit a viable option to get to work. I think, but a lot of it, I think, also has to do with our land use. And so, going forward, how HART participates in the conversation on inclusionary zones and job placement and economic development, I think is critically important, because we can't buy enough buses, you know, to get the job done, based on how big Tampa has, and where all those dots are. I was going to ask you, in your multi-dot Hillsborough, county map, you had red dots and blue dots, and I was trying to discern which ones were which. But the tan map where you had, where everybody lived, and there were red dots in those areas. Those red dots reflect job centers?
It was dealing with the number of employees of that particular dot. There's a corresponding color legend that corresponds with those. There's two primary data sources. One is the census of the CPPT, Census Public Transport. Remember what the acronym is. But there's a data set that's built from American Community Survey data. Census Transportation Planning Package is what it's called. That exists and allows you to do geographic analysis of home to work flows. There's also an online tool that the Census Division called On the Map, which is a very powerful GIS-based web tool that, in 4 hours you can do amazing things on it. Was the blue dot one that allows you to really understand where people work and where they live, and that's built from administrative records. It's updated every year. And you can pick whatever geographies you want. It'll give you income profiles of the folks. So those are both very powerful data sets that let you understand your market characteristics in urban areas. This region, there was some work about a decade ago where a fellow did his dissertation looking at job clustering and job distribution. And we were next to LA as the most dispersed and most unconcentrated employment in the country. So not only do we have multiple job centers, what we do have is spread all over the place. So we're not only not clustered particularly strongly, but we're very distributed as well. And that has to do with the mix of the nature of employment in this area, as well as the land use. I mean, obviously land use is part of it. We've got a lot of service industry, we've got a lot of light industry, we've we've got a lot of stuff that's in the communities as, you know, retail, education, facilities, et cetera, are dispersed across the community. We don't have high concentrations of white-collar employment in single destinations. We don't have the big, huge anchors like state or federal government or major corporate local headquarters and stuff that, you know, are the big draw to attract a lot of synergy. And so we don't have that clustering and concentration that some other areas do, and that makes it challenging. The other thing is our geography. Not only do we have 400 square miles of Tampa Bay, but we've got a lot of you know, canals and wetlands, and we just don't have the intensiveness of development, some of which is policy, but some of which isn't, some of which is inherent in the geography and topography of the region.
Well, the reason I brought that up is that when you go back to your 2017 ACS commuting mode share by income and transit method, basically, when you look at bus and trolley traffic and the income areas or ranges that most utilize those features, it is basically, you know, at our AMI or our average median income and below that are the best utilizers of transit,
Yeah.
specifically bus and or trolley bus.
Right.
So in terms of how we invest going forward, until we're able to, you know, raise our average AMI or attract industries that can pay the higher wages, because what the range of incomes that were highly attracted to using rail, maybe not exclusively, but using rail, you know, we're in excess of $100,000 or more.
Right.
And then it peaked very quickly. So the issue of what I perceive, and you can correct me if you feel, you know, rail is a great way of getting a lot of people somewhere very quickly, and frequently has more frequency than what we can do getting on a bus. Whereas bus is a way of getting you to a lot of different places with more opportunity, but maybe not as quickly. But when it's the only choice you have,
Yes.
it works. And based on the average, you know, median income of people in Hillsborough County, we can be best served by rapidly expanding our bus system to be able to address the needs of our communities. If we can figure out how to get our land use and our affordable housing act together in such a way that we allow our job centers and our affordable housing resources in the same space or a similar space without it being all over the county. So,
Yeah,
am I reading that right? Is that?
No, you are, and a couple of things. The high income folks are only interested in transit if it's a premium high quality transit, so there's a kind of a natural synergy there. And there are a lot of communities, again, at the national level, that have invested a lot of money, you know, getting folks from downtowns to airports, and the convention centers and arenas and coliseums and et cetera, which tend to be venues attended by high-income folks. So a lot of the industry has focused a lot of attention on those markets as opposed to kind of core services that penetrate service jobs and you know, light industry jobs and working class jobs. Now that they're not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of airport workers that use trains to the airport to work there. You know, so it's not one or the other. It's all of the markets are mixed and integrated. But the data is fairly compelling in terms of what the trend has been in terms of where we're competitive or where we've been growing ridership.
Director Shanahan?
Thanks. You've covered a lot of the question that I had, but I think it's interesting. We look at the modes. Oh, sorry, I got a bad neck. We look at the modes being offered, you know, to the population we're servicing. So it's not all about only buses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at those electric vehicles. I still think, going back to our last month's statistics, you know, our downtown trolley is up 169%. Now we're offering it for free. So
Right.
I don't know how long that's sustainable. But also the elderly, the services that we're providing in terms of the vans, which has really been, I think, a growing targeted population that will continue to grow and be a focus. And so I think all of those are in the Hillsborough numbers, and it gives us an opportunity to look at the modes, the population, and really making each one of those, better and better, I think, year over year. Like I did think when we launched First Mile, Last Mile, in concert with, I think it ended up being taxis, but with sort of the, TNC platform was actually, a good way to be adaptive to the marketplace and hopefully provide better services. But I think we have to think about being I think, and Mr. Melendez always says this, be a mobility organization and not just say it's all about buses. Because when I see that CNG 40, like you could have a bus corridor and have the buses go for the bookend of the morning and the evening, and have the rest of the service be provided by vans or a 20-person based on sort of the usage. If you got really sophisticated about maximizing, who's riding it during what hours of the day, and sort of be a multi-transit, organization, responding to the priorities in that hour of the population.
And there's multiple missions that,
Right.
that public transit can do. One is the mobility side, and the other is the resource efficiency side. And I personally am a strong supporter that I think the industry underemphasizes its role in terms of meeting mobility needs of folks who don't have choices. That's a critical need. That's a need that has strong political support ubiquitously. And it's not an easy one to meet because of the challenges and the expense of the customized paratransit services. And it's not a resource efficient need, but it's a real critical need. And it builds tremendous goodwill. There are communities in Florida that spend, as much as half of their budget on paratransit services. And interestingly, when the ridership trends, when we look at them in a little more detail, the paratransit's kind of oblivious to this because it's not influenced by the same factors. It's a dependency. They're dependent on public transit. There are no other competitive choices for that market generally. So it's been a relatively strong market, and frankly, oftentimes the limited demand, it's only the supply issues. If there were more supply, you can grow demand easily by pricing and availability of service hours, etc. Wait times, those kinds of things. If you can change those factors, the demand will grow. But it's not a cheap or easy service.
Right.
Well, I think we're comparing apples to
different
oranges
measures.
in many
Two different
ways. I mean,
measures.
1/6 of our services, is paratransit, and it is a federal mandate that, it's not paid for by the federal government, but required of us. But when we talk about the TNC services, I think we have to really recognize, I think this was never part of the discussion here, but that we're paying, our cost was $16 per ride for under 3 miles, $16. So the person taking it was paying $3. That got to be too expensive, $1. The service was, even at those incredible prices, was totally, we wouldn't have never had it but for being totally paid for by FDOT that was willing to pay those kind of prices. That is, we would never be paying those prices for bus service, and don't for the most part. Our trips are, when we have it serving in areas that are in under 5 miles, it's incredibly efficient. The buses fill up all day. Even here, even with our low frequency, and do we have bus service? I take it along Florida Avenue. People are going throughout the day. But also just in terms of, and I have no problems with expanding our options, whatever they may be. I just want the cost effectiveness and the ability to provide as many people with opportunities. And as we know, with the TNC companies, Uber and Lyft, they survive off venture capital. They're $13 billion, Uber is, in the hole. I think they just added another couple billion just in the last quarter. They went public, their stock has dropped. It's not I don't see it as a sustainable plan. They're going up with their prices, down, they're starting, they were paying their drivers less. That's become an issue. There's even been strikes in different cities. In the cities that they do operate in, they're causing massive congestion problems, looking at 20 to 25% in Boston, New York, San Francisco. It's an issue. And then they don't serve the areas that are suburban areas, for instance. So like here and other places, it's a difficulty. But looks like we're ready to go here, I think.
I just had one quick comment. Well, I just want to note regarding the ride share and you know, Dr. Pulzine, I think I'm looking for the slide. You commented, I think, on just, you know, cost of service and you know, providing service. To me, you know, I think the point to be taken from your comments, Commissioner Kemp, is transportation is expensive and someone has to pay the tab. And I think, you know, so I think as long as we keep that in mind and we're realistic, and, you know, then it's about deciding, you know, what options are best for our community, so.
Yeah, you need to look at total cost, op and capital across the modes and look at the purposes that are served, absolutely.
And then just one quick comment on the workforce, or I'm sorry, the commuting from home. I think that's the other big impact that I saw, and I've seen it in other conferences and heard the numbers are staggering. And so I think as we, you know, look at that, as we look at providing service for employment, we need to really evaluate, are those jobs that require a person to go there? Meaning, there are two different kind of jobs today. There are jobs you can do anywhere, or there are jobs where you have to be there, and I think that's something we should keep in mind.
And just to comment on that, and then I know you want to wrap up. Of all of the things that have played out, the one that we don't know whether or not it's played out is the communication substitution for travel. We're seeing, you know, continued decline in or growth in telecommuting, and you know where that will go, we don't know. And we're seeing a growth in other e-shopping is continuing to grow. It's picking up a percentage of resales or retail sales every year. You know, we're seeing more online. So we're going to be, you know, we may continue to lose total trips to communication substitution and even socially. You know, and that hasn't necessarily played itself out. And just as in the case of Washington, D.C. that I mentioned, you know, when you build an asset that you think is going to be used 5 or 7 days a week, and you find out it's used 3 or 4 days a week, you've got to amortize things differently, and that's a challenge to transit folks, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I think we're all set here?
Yep.
Thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you.